Welcome to the
Welcome
Learning
back,
Can't Wait
everybody.
podcast,
I am
a
so
Full Mind
excited to be
production.
here with you for
At
another
Full Mind,
episode.
our
of the
vision
Learning
is to
Can't
ensure
Wait
every
podcast.
child has access to
Today,
an exceptional
we have Charlene
education.
Mack, the founding
Each episode, we will be joined by
25
pathfinders
Forward,
within
a
and around the
firm
education
focus on
space
making
who are bringing
power
about
practical.
transformational change
Welcome,
on behalf
Charlene. How
of
you
deserving
doing?
students.
Hey, welcome.
I
Happy
am your
good
host,
day,
Hayley
I'm so glad
Spira-Bauer.
to be here. Thank you for having me.
I am so glad you are here, and I'm so grateful to Mohan of Our Turn for introducing us. I love to meet people that have been and are continuing to do the work in education, and you are absolutely no exception. I think the folks listening today are going to be incredibly inspired by what you have to share.
Thank you so much. I don't know, but we're gonna say some stuff today.
That's the point. That's the point. Let's say some stuff. Let's see where it takes us. So, Charlene, can you start us off by telling everybody, how did you come to be the personal and professional version of yourself?
Ooh, so let's go back, and it's all gonna connect, I promise. The organizer in me always tells stories. So my first year of teaching, I had an opportunity to teach. I'll just say the city, not the school. And I was killing it. I think I was killing it because I'm the youngest of 7. So I used to have a little pretend classroom. So I was teaching folks since forever. And in that first year of teaching, I absolutely loved every single thing about it. I loved putting up boards. I love setting out pencils. I love the notebook paper. I love the highlighters. So when it came to the end of the school year, it was no different. And you know how you remember the end of the year test you used to take as a kid or a student?
Can't forget them.
Yeah.
Those Iowa tests in New York State, they were something.
Yes. So imagine that time and your first year teaching, but I was excited. Usually folks are nervous, but I was excited. The kids were learning and I wanted them to show what they were learning. So I'm co-facilitating the end of the year test. And I was walking up and down the aisle, thinking about my grocery list, trying to pass my time because it's boring to facilitate. Thinking about this person I shouldn't have dated. And then out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. I saw the person I was co-facilitating with pick up a pencil, erase an answer, fill in another answer, and then proceed. And I freaked out. I was like, what's happening? We're not supposed to help students in this way. And I ran out of the classroom. When I went to the school leader, I spoke about what I saw. And the response was, you're the last one hired. You'll be the first one to go. When I sat in that moment, I was shocked. I remember driving from school and I was scared. I was crying. And I did what I did back then when my parents were living. I called them and I was recapping what happened. And my dad, he interrupted immediately and he said, hey, the children need a champion, and any excuse you make to not stand up for equity will be a lie. And I was like, dang.
Wow.
I was like, dang, this is what we're doing. So I remember challenging it. It eventually escalated to the superintendent. Come to find out, cheating was happening for a while. It led to me having 7 school leaders in less than 14 months of my teaching career, teaching 4 grades in less than a year. But it more so led me on this path of power building and understanding who holds who accountable. There's no way that should have gone on that long, especially because folks knew. There was no way that it should have happened at all. So with the relationships that I have from parents, I constantly think back to that moment. If I knew now what I know about organizing, what could I have done? What could we have changed? So it led me down this journey of power building and community organizing, first starting with the Industrial Areas Foundation, then doing some national community organizing fellowship work with Leadership for Educational Equity, organizing in my hometown of Charlotte, shifting to Innovate Public Schools to lead our national partnerships and training work, serving as a teaching fellow at Marshall Gans at Harvard, and then the work that I'm doing now, starting my own firm to make power more practical.
As I said a moment ago, wow, it sounds like the most pivotal turning point a person could have in their journey to decide what path they take. Like you had a fork in the road. You could have backed down. You could have turned your eye away. You could have done a million things, but take action and really, be a whistleblower here.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, it takes a lot for you to walk in your power. I mean, for folks that can't see me, I'm a dark-skinned Black woman. It also takes a lot to do it in the skin, and I'm constantly reminded of that. And I'm also reminded of, if I waste time, it's a form of inequity, and I'm not here to sanitize what it takes to pursue it.
How has that held true to you throughout your career? Obviously, you're working in the space to help make power practical. So how does that get actualized in the places and spaces you've worked and lived throughout your career?
So the most recent examples, a few months ago, actually worked with a group of folks in Utah, and they're like, hey, we did some really dope policy work. We also did some really dope work during the rise of COVID, but we also know to create stickiness in this work, we need to have a different mindset. They didn't use the word power at first, but I worked with them to define it, as well as cultivate an experience where families were making decisions. So fast forward over the course of 6-7 months, we first started out with them defining who their people are. And then at the end of those months, we gathered a people's assembly, close to 140 people or so, with 19 different cities. And it was a power building training. And over that course of that weekend, they surfaced their top 3 priorities for their political platform. So that's how we make it practical. It is a beautiful experience. It is a messy one. But I am really big on the applied learning and coupling the espoused with the action. Because again, I believe that wasting time is a form of inequity.
That sounds really awesome. And I imagine that, one thing I find challenging about our education system, and I imagine you're working in and related to things education oriented, given your background. So correct me if I'm wrong in that assumption. I don't want to be incorrect.
No, you're right. I do. I did.
So I imagine, one challenge that I routinely hear from folks that join this podcast is about the differences from across the country, from state to state. And we know that there's right now a very political dynamic occurring that in education, as it always has, but it's pronounced in different ways today than it has been previously, that this work would be really nuanced depending on the context and environment. Do you find that to be true in your work? And if so, how does that look?
There might be a little pushback here. I would say, yes, it's nuanced, but power is power. A lot of folks are apprehensive at first when we talk about power building. They're like, oh, this would never work in my city. This would never work with my people. This would never work with my leadership. Like, no, that's your mindset. I've literally seen power activated across many different demographics, from cities as small but beautiful and diverse and Black as East St. Louis, to larger cities like Atlanta or Charlotte or Houston. I've seen it overseas. So even though there are nuances and issues, power is power, and the activization, that's not a word, is it?
You know what? We're going to make it a word right
that we'll go a different direction because I'm struggling. The application of what we call the community organizing skill, the community organizing cycle can be applied anywhere.
So it sounds like there's a framework regardless of the setting, and the framework can be applied and thus, as you say, activated using this community organizing cycle. Tell me more about that. I want to know more about what that looks like.
Of course, I love to talk about community organizing. So it starts with what we believe to be the most revolutionary tool, listening. And that tool is something called an individual meeting. So listening and learning. Now, how this is different from advocacy is that we aren't just listening to listen. We're also listening to surface issues. We're listening to identify leaders, and you're with them along the journey. That listening goes to learning. And that learning can look anywhere, like what are the issues? How can we make this issue practical and applied in our city? How do I go from something broad, from racism in an education system to a restorative justice pilot? Or my 3-year-old isn't able to be in a building, a structured learning environment, to universal pre-K. and we work with folks. But the thing is, we do it with community members, with family members, with parents, with students. And then you can't stop there. One of my favorite people, Ken Fujimoto, who organized along Cesar Chavez and a brilliant organizer, talks about how action is like breathing to the body. You go from listening to learning to acting. And what that can look like, it depends on the type of campaign. It can be asking a key decision maker to move on something, to working internally to build your internal capacity. And then always don't forget to celebrate and rest. Rest is also a part of the power building work, as well as reflection.
I've been really fortunate to learn from some really brilliant organizers like Mohan and other folks from the National Parents Union and Educators for Excellence. And one thing that I found is I'm glad you say rest, because there was this tireless year over year, decade over decade energy that's required to sustain this work. You mentioned rest as part of the cycle. I'm actually interviewing a bunch of school leaders and superintendents tomorrow about this topic of work-life balance, quality of life outside of work, and rest in order to sustain the important work they're doing in schools. But yet it's difficult. There's so much turnover in school leadership right now. How difficult do you find it to be to convince community organizers to incorporate rest as well?
Thank you for that question. I think that if you are a seasoned discipline organizer, it doesn't take a lot to convince you. Actually, I don't have to do the convincing, because you understand that it is a discipline. It's a part of your intentionality. One of the things I did as an organizer when I was organizing on the ground is, at the top of the year with parent leaders, with families, I would create a calendar of the legislative cycle, a calendar of our campaign. And I would start though with questions like, hey, when do you want to be off? Like, you can be off from this civic work. You could take time off. Now, there will be heavy seasons and we may still call on you, but when do you want to be off? When do you want to take a vacation? So when we teach that you need institutions to fight institutions, and a part of that institutionalization is intentionality. So if we're not being intentional about time off just as much as we're being intentional about strategy and its application, then we aren't creating sustainability. We aren't building capacity. We aren't building leaders. And I would even dare to say we aren't building something that's going to live beyond ourselves, because not doing so to set back and rest and reflect is not intentional.
I want to clap and snap and I'm not yes, that is so true. I think it's that sustainability piece that, burnout is so real for so many people, and especially for populations that are enduring some secondary trauma by the work that they do, and that are working in really challenging structural inequity systems of structural inequity. And so, yeah, you can't sustain the work unless you're really giving yourself the space to have the energy to show up every day.
Yeah. And another thing is and you also have to give space for the work to look different than you planned. If you're holding everything as an organizer, then again, there's an opportunity for growth there, because one, you aren't creating space for leadership. And two, that may be a sign that your capacity isn't what you think it is. Too often and I've seen sort of the tokenization of Black folks or people of color sometimes, oh, you're that one Black parent, or you're that one brown parent. No, you need to find more. You need to build leaders. In organizing, we teach that a leader is a person with a following. And too often we get into that burned out phase or lack of sustainable phase because we don't have a following, or we don't teach others to have a following. Give it up. Get rid of the kiss the ring mentality of going 30 years before you can lead this work. No. If someone is waiting that long, that's a reflection of your leadership, not a reflection of them.
I actually consider that one of the practices that, and I am not in community organizing work, but one of the practices that I think translates based on what you're sharing here is the idea too, that you're surrounding yourself with people that are smarter than you, and that you're elevated, you're growing and learning, and you have a clear plan for succession as you make room for the next generation of thoughtful, intelligent, inspired leaders below you.
Yeah. Or you're just surrounding yourself with people.
Yeah.
Like people, because sometimes and if again with the intentionality, one of the things we teach is motivational task design, and it creates these tiered approaches for how folks can engage. If you aren't being intentional about how to activate the gifts and the leadership inside of people, again, you will lose capacity, you will not be able to sustain the work, or you will burn out your leaders. And I believe, in addition to wasting time, that's also a form of inequity because you're not growing the work.
Thank you for sharing that, Charlene.
Of course.
Really powerful. I have a question for you about where we are today within and around schools.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots to be proud of and excited about. And I think we have to, as you said, celebrate those wins and successes. And there's a lot of challenges in school reform, school change, school innovation, depending on what you want to call it, depending on who you're talking to. How are you looking at the current state of our schools, and what both gives you hope and do you feel like is a challenge before us?
Ooh, it's a beautiful, complex issue that I still believe is rooted in hope. The current state of our schools is like, they're still our schools. They're going to be there. There is a hunger. That's what I will say. That's the current state. There is a hunger for something different. There is a hunger, I'll even say, for power. When folks and parents and teachers and students and school leaders and district leaders and superintendents are exposed to power, for the most part, depending on their mindset, they're like, okay, this is different, and I want to activate in a new way. And that's where 2541 comes in. So I would say the current state is one of hunger, to try, and I don't want to say new things, but to try things that double down on keeping the main thing the main thing. That may sound vague, but I'm very resistant to say like all schools have the same need. No, power building gets to the need that works for your school. Power building gets to the need that works for your city. Yes, there are federal, there are state things. And I would say one of the things that provides hope in power building is that if you get closest to those that are impacted by this daily, we can do more change. We don't like folks speaking on behalf of us, so why are we speaking on behalf of parents without first seeing what their needs are? Why are we speaking on behalf of students without having a conversation? When we do that, we make an assumption that we know what's best for them, that we know what they need. So oftentimes the policies are out of alignment with what's needed. So yeah, those are the things I would lift, is hunger and like misalignment.
You started the conversation with speaking on listening, and you circled back to that listening. Listening is a skill.
It is a skill.
Charlene, what tactical or practical advice could you give for folks that want to be better at listening, whether for the sake of community organizing or even just for their work in school districts right now that are listening to this podcast?
The skill around listening, and I got this in my early organizing career, and I forget who is where the quote originated from, but the skill, or I don't want to say trick, but the discipline behind listening is being both interested and interesting, creating this space of curiosity about the person and also inviting curiosity about yourselves. Too often we go in making assumptions about someone's self-interest without actually clarifying it, without actually seeing what fuels them, without actually asking, what are your values? And as a result, we make assumptions about folks on the right, we make assumptions about folks on the left, and we aren't able to move because we're moving on our assumed self-interest versus the clarified self-interest. The other piece I want to lift, though, is like, it's a two-way street. Sometimes we go into spaces and we say, follow me. But hey, why are you worth following? Are you sharing anything about yourself? Is there an exchange? Is there a sharing of values, or creating a shared pool of meaning behind the work? So pausing to create a space where you're listening with one another. Now, this isn't a private conversation, it's a public one, but you could still talk about values. So that's what I would lift, is like being interested and interesting and inviting space for a dual curiosity.
You were so, I like asked that question off the cuff. We didn't talk about it, but like, this work so deeply. Obviously, you are an expert in this space.
Thank
I
you.
just appreciate the way that you were like, you really already know the answer to that question. Like, listening again, it is such a skill. Even like leadership, management books that I all talk about listening. And you said, you just read a book on this. Have you written a book yet?
Not yet, but I might. Just
Should.
I mean, one of the reasons I started 2541 is I want folks to be able to listen to different voices. I want to change what the face of organizing experience can look like and diversify it. We go back to maybe 2 or 3 white men as the origin of community organizing. We need to change that face. And I hope to shake that mess up.
I think you're shaking it up. You say hope, but I think it's happening.
Thank you. I'm here for it.
Charlene, I'm glad you touched a little bit on the work of 2541 and why it exists. When you and I spoke, you specifically named changing the face of community organizing.
Yeah.
I think that's really powerful. I'm wondering, as I'm talking to you right now, who else you lean on in this space and who else you've worked with in the past that you feel like is really aligned to this way of thinking and this forward momentum in community organizing?
Oh, there's so many. One, Jamal Nelson. He is a brilliant brother who does dope work on the EDBI side of organizing and power building to create space for mindsets, culture, etc., and how to build power without equity. To Ken Fujimoto, a brilliant organizer who's been in this game since high school. It's been his only job since high school. Ken Fujimoto is brilliant. He showed up for me as a Black woman when I was organizing in Charlotte. And together we secured $132.2 million. It was the first time our city ever released funds, our county rather, ever released funds in advance of a bond. And when other folks were like, this is impossible, Ken Fujimoto was right by my side and grounded me in the fundamentals of community organizing. Someone else that I lean on, I would say, is Dr. Yasmin Mumby. Just started her firm a year or so ago. It's called the Ringo, brilliant organizer. She's the only one of the organizers I know that's been able to turn out 3,000 people and has win over win over win. And she's able to create this really cool space of leadership, thoughtfulness, mindfulness in both body and soul. And I can keep going. I don't want to get in trouble and forget any names, but when I tell you that I'm in tremendously blessed, like Shonda Kauser comes to mind. Spark Bookhart. There are so many people that come to mind, and I cannot forget my parents, Pastor Charles and Connie Mack, who grounded me in this. So there are so many that come to mind, and anyone I forget, please forgive me, but there is a list of people who have invested in me, and I'm super grateful for it.
Thank you for sharing some of that list. We know it's not exhaustive.
Yes, it's not exhaustive.
And it is inspiring for folks listening to be able to check out other leaders in this space that have brought you joy and brought you support and made this work even more possible and exciting to be part of. So thank you for sharing that.
Of course.
Charlene, I have to ask you my final question, which again, the time has really flown here together.
It has.
I'm wondering what advice you would give a teacher who's starting their career today.
Say the tough thing. Say the tough thing. If a session after school is being facilitated and you have parents that English is in their primary language, say the tough thing to make sure you get a translator. If your resources aren't being allocated equitably, say the tough thing. If you see that Black children are being suspended at a higher rate, say the tough thing. Say the tough thing, and you can couple it with love. I would actually say that saying the tough thing is a form of love because you're promoting equity. And I would say, thank you for the work that you're doing.
Oh, I have the chills. That was No, I haven't heard that before, and it's important. That is so important. And is your thread line. It's how you began your story today with me on the podcast. And it has driven you in your work of making power practical, and definitely guided you in creating 2541. And I'm excited to see where it goes. I'm excited to follow your journey. Charlene, thank you so very much for coming on the podcast today.
Of course, we're just getting started. I look forward to the fellowships, the trainings, and the revolution to come. Thank you.
And thank you for everybody who tuned into the podcast today.
Thanks for listening to the Learning Can't Wait podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and share this episode. Be the first to know when we have a new episode by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or have a suggestion for an episode, email us at podcast@fullmindlearning.com.